Okay, so let me tell you a story. It's a story of survival, written across generations and an ocean. We're going to follow two families, the Chiassons and the Thibeaults, and their journey from France to the New World. It's a journey that takes them through an absolute catastrophe and then reinvention, and it really defines this crucial and honestly often overlooked chapter of North American history.
So their story really starts with a choice. You have to imagine it's the mid-1600s, and families like the Chassarons are basically stuck, tied to the land in rural France, with not much hope for a better life.
Okay, so in the mid-1600s, you've got this farmer, and he makes a huge gamble. He packs up his family and moves them from the quiet, predictable life of the countryside to the chaotic docks of La Rochelle. He was trading a life he knew, farming to just get by, for the slim chance of earning a wage. He was putting his family right on the edge of a whole new world of possibilities. You gotta understand, this wasn't just a city, it was a doorway, a place where the old world looked out onto the new, and the Atlantic Ocean wasn't seen as an end, but as a highway to a different future.
Now, Pierre himself, he never actually crossed that ocean, but what he did was give his kids a view of the horizon. And it was his son, Guignon, who would be the one to sail right past it, leaving France behind to help build a new society in a land they called Acadia.
You know, this wasn't a one-and-done kind of thing. It was a multi-generational project. Guillaume Chiasson, he's the one who makes the trip from France in the 1660s and settles in a place called Beaubazin. Then, decades later, as the family grows, his descendant, Joseph-François Chiasson, pushes even further east, helping to found a brand new community on what we now call Prince Edward Island. They weren't just settling, they were expanding, putting down really, really deep roots.
And here's the thing, they absolutely could not do it alone. This was not some world of rugged individuals. Nope. To survive, they had to work together. We're talking about massive diking projects that involved whole communities working to reclaim land from the sea. They literally transformed these tidal marshes into incredibly fertile farmland. Their entire society was built in cooperation.
So the really crucial point here is that they created something entirely new. They weren't just French colonists anymore. They were Acadians, a distinct people with their own culture, deeply tied to their Catholic faith, their farms, and, most importantly, to each other. It was a world they had built from the salt marshes up.
But here's the thing. While the Acadians were busy building a world based on cooperation, the world around them was gearing up for conflict, and their peaceful home was sitting directly in the path of a geopolitical storm between two of the world's biggest superpowers. And that storm had a name, the 7 Years' War. This was a massive global conflict between Britain and France.
So what happened? Well, in 1755, the imperial conflict between Britain and France hit a boiling point. The British governor of Nova Scotia demanded that the Acadians sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to the British crown. But they were worried this would force them to fight against other French people, their own kin, so they refused. The governor's response was swift and devastating. He ordered their total removal. It was an act that historians today have described as a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Now let's be really clear about this. This was not a relocation. It was a violent, forced displacement. Families were rounded up, their homes and farms were burned to the ground, and they were herded onto ships. The whole process was chaotic and unbelievably brutal. It was a nightmare of disease, starvation, and shipwreck. And the scale of this is just staggering. Out of an Acadian population of around 14,000, 11,500 people were forcibly deported. Thousands and thousands of them would die in the process. And this huge, abstract number becomes a very real tragedy when we connect it back to our story. Because Joseph-François Chiasson, the man who had helped build a new community from scratch, was caught right in the middle of all of it. The British policy of forced separation was just devastatingly effective. Logistics, not family ties, decided who went on which ship. So in 1758, Joseph-François was torn from his wife and children and put on a totally separate vessel. He died just a year later, in exile, in France, a country he had never even seen, an entire ocean away from everyone and everything he loved. And the violence was just widespread. British forces engaged in brutal frontier warfare, burning villages, torturing civilians. Any Acadian resistance was met with extreme force, including, yes, scalping. But for many, the greatest danger was the journey itself. The sinking of just two ships, the Violet and the Duke William, killed over 600 people. That was the single greatest loss of life during the entire expulsion.
The British scattered the Acadians all over their American colonies and even shipped thousands back to Europe. The goal was to make sure they could never regroup. A people who were once rooted in one place were now spread all across the Atlantic world.
And from this scattering, a global diaspora was born. A lot of the exiles eventually made their way down to Spanish Louisiana, where the word Acadian slowly morphed into Cajun. Others were stuck in Europe, and after 1764, some even managed to make their way back home, only to find that their farms had been given away.
But this story does not end in destruction, not at all. Starting in the 1760s, the survivors began the absolutely monumental task of finding each other and rebuilding their lives, basically from the ashes. You know, survival often just came down to where you ended up. It was pure chance. The Chiasson family line, the one we've been following, was completely fragmented. The survivors were scattered everywhere, and many, like Joseph Francois, died overseas. But other Acadian families who were deported to, or maybe managed to escape to Quebec, they found a degree of stability. There, they could regroup inside established French-speaking parishes, and that offered a chance at continuity that was denied to so many others.
So what about the surviving Chiassons? Well, while Joseph Francois died in exile, other branches of his family somehow endured. Against all odds, they found their way back, not to their original homes, of course, those were long gone, but to new areas, like Gloucester County in New Brunswick. And there, they did it all over again. They built new, tight-knit Acadian communities, held together by their faith and their shared trauma. Okay, now let's jump forward over a century. A totally new challenge forced another great migration. This time, from the 1880s to the 1920s, the reasons were economic, not military, as the Acadians crossed into the industrial age.
So by the late 1800s, those communities they had so carefully rebuilt were facing a new problem. Families were getting bigger, and they were running out of farmland. At the exact same time, the Industrial Revolution was booming just south of the border. The textile mills in New England were offering the promise of steady wages. So what happened? Descendants of the Thibeaults and the Chiassons began to move once again, this time crossing south into the United States for work.
This comparison right here, it says it all, doesn't it? On the left, that's the world they were leaving. It's rural, it's domestic, it's a life defined by the seasons and the family. And on the right, that's the world they were entering. It's urban, it's industrial, it's a life of wage labor, all governed by the factory clock.
So when you step back and look at this entire history, from the shores of France to the farms of Acadia, through a brutal expulsion and into the mill towns of America, a really clear pattern starts to emerge, a pattern of survival.
Their story is defined by movement, by adaptation, and by this unbelievable determination to remain a people, even when they were, as one historian put it, scattered across the Atlantic. They always moved forward, but they never, ever forgot where they came from.
The story of the Acadians is just an incredible testament to how culture and identity can endure against all odds. It started with one family's simple search for a better life, and it ended in a tragedy that tested the absolute limits of human survival. And it leaves us with this really powerful question: how does a people survive its own scattering?